Great. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Fear by Jason Mohaghegh. Fear, the seminar. I'm just going to start by reading the description of the seminar and then a short bio before Jason takes over. So, what are the 1,000 typologies of fear? Is fear a primordial problem of consciousness? Does it rest in the earliest realms of perception, sensation, psyche, imagination? Or does it emanate from the outer atmosphere as a kind of spatial mood? In this seminar, we will explore both those supposed universal categories of phobia, fear of heights, needles, insects, confined spaces, and their corresponding nightmares, dreams of falling, drowning, being chased, while also studying the possibility of new fright modes that expand the boundaries of dread, horror, terror, paranoia, etc. Our primary resource and method throughout this course, conspiracy theories. Seminar takers will generate their own original archive by seeking out the strangest conspiracy theories in circulation today: secret societies, online demons, alien invasion, medical and technological manipulation, doomsday scenarios, decoding their implications, and thereby allowing us to ask a final question about the transforming horizon of fear and technology in an age of virtuality, holograms, and metaverses. Jason Mohaghegh is a philosopher, literary theorist, and professor of comparative literature. His work engages movements of experimental thought in the so-called East and West, with particular attention to concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, extremism, mania, disappearance, night, evil, secrecy, and apocalyptic writing. He has published 9 books to date, including 2 volumes titled Omnicide 1 and 2 on madness, and 2 volumes on night titled Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark, and Night 2, A Philosophy of the Last World. My name is Caroline, and I'll be your moderator for this seminar. And now I'm going to pass the mic to Jason.
Thank you, Karen. It's wonderful to see everyone. I'm extremely excited for this seminar because I'm going to be dropping some very obscure, rare, strange sort of forms of knowledge for you, some pieces of trivia and information that at the very least will make you the coolest person at your next party gathering, to repeat some of these things. So I've been in the archives looking for long lost theories and figures, and we're going to jump in today, just right out the gate, into questions of fear. But let me first bring this forward. Is everybody able to see the slides here?
Yep.
All right. Second. So the first thing, and I always just like this as a precursor and a sort of cautionary note before we enter a territory. Fear is an infinity machine, which is to say it's a strange thing to analyze because there are as many potential phobias conceivably as there are phenomena in existence. You could be afraid of razors, you could be afraid of storms, you could be afraid of walls, sort of. So this it's a strange thing to analyze something that has such all-encompassing potentialities. But each one of those has its own unique prototype that has its own clockwork logic. So what I want us to develop, as we always do in our workshop sessions together, is a kind of acute respect for the intricacy of each typology of fear that we invent. And this is even to say that even within themselves, the fear of the spider is not the same every time around. And that's something that I want to get into today. So obviously, let's run through, it's always good to run through sort of the regimes of knowledge that dominate our perception of something, precisely so we can deviate and become escape artists and elude them. So first, we can compartmentalize fears if we wanted to into fears of spaces, the fear of the forest, the alleyway, the abandoned house. And it's good to think of horror cinema, for instance, or horror literature, and how brilliantly it can manipulate and play upon spatiality, and all that. And actually, where it's one of the few genres where the space itself becomes the main character. So the haunted house, or sort of any other spaces of terror. They actually are more central than the characters themselves. You have fears of objects, fear of the box, fear of the doll, the syringe, fear of figures, the stranger, the gravedigger, the clown. Some of those may have entered your nightmares here and there over time. Fear of phenomena. Some people are terrified of crowds, others of lightning, some of blood, the sight of blood, some the texture of blood, right? Weird thing, actually, here's an interesting one. We'll get into this. Some people are terrified by the sight of blood, but like the taste of blood, right? Or the smell of blood. There are even expert perfumers, masters of fragrance in French towns along the French Riviera, the French Mediterranean, that place blood, drops of blood into their colognes, precisely because it has an attractive, repulsive kind of effect to it. Their fear of events. So we can fear failure, fear death, fear the millennium turning. So we know about millenarianism, people going crazy before the turn of a millennium or even a turn of a century. Interestingly, the fear of death is not in the top 10 fears, most universal or common fears. Death is too abstract to a certain extent to be something that people fear in their everydayness. We'll talk about that too. And then there's the fear of the self. So that's fear of loss of something, of violence being perpetrated against someone, of transforming. We fear transformation. And we fear power, the power of others and our own power, right? So let's run through the cliches of our collective human consciousness, our sort of collective human psychology. The most universal phobias, and you can get this didn't take me difficult research. This is a Google search. The most common universal phobias are heights, needles, deep water, confined spaces, storms, dogs, snakes, insects, darkness, and being alone. Now, interestingly some of you may know that Carl Jung, the rejected disciple ultimately of Freud, he was very intrigued by a theory he had of the collective unconscious, where he believed that certain objects of fear were kind of programmed prototypically into our consciousness from millions of years ago in our evolutionary development. So he'd mentioned the fear of snakes is because they are the most predatory species that would eat us when we were living in trees, in sort of before even ancient civilizations, when we were part of the realm of animality. The thing that we feared most when we were sort of monkeys in the trees were huge snakes who could devour us whole. And so that terror of the jungle persists to this day in all of our folklores and our visual imaginations of the devil. The devil is almost always a snake or a serpent, especially in monotheistic cultures, but even in others, right? And there have even been sociological studies of Inuit children living in frozen tundra places who have nightmares of snakes, even though they've never seen a snake. So that's an interesting thing to consider. The most universal nightmares are falling, drowning, suffocation, dying, being chased, being lost, being late, being attacked, becoming someone else, feeling trapped, having a car accident, nudity, humiliation, visitations from the dead, or bodily malformation, teeth or your hair falling out. And I see people smiling because I just hit the button on like 7 different nightmares that you've also had over time. This doesn't make you boring, sort of necessarily, or lacking in extraordinary possibilities. It's just to say this is the collective reservoir from which we all drink, according to psychoanalysis, right? Now, just to get it out of the way, but I swear I'm going to take a real nasty turn against Freud in a minute here, because I'm going to introduce you to a long-lost enemy of his that almost no one knows about anymore. Someone who got swept under the rug with the revolution of psychoanalysis. Freud dominated the scene, and rightfully so. He's a brilliant figure, an ingenious writer. But there's another figure that's little known to most of you, and you're going to get to know him today, who challenged Freud in wonderful ways. And he's born in the same year. He's actually 3 months older than Freud. And you've probably never heard the name, but we'll get to him in a minute. So Freud's basic concept of phobia is that it either emanates, and he wavers on this because it's a complex question, from it being an individual trauma or a primordial drive. So that means it's either an inherited again, universal unconscious problem that goes back. And when you look at his anthropological works like Moses and Monotheism or Totem and Taboo, this is when Freud even goes and looks at myths, even though he hates myths, he hates religion, but he studies them again, and he studies ancient civilizations and their rituals briefly in order to demonstrate that certain objects of fear and desire have been around for thousands of years, across civilizations, across cultures, across regions, even to his credit, very progressively across genders, across class. You know, it's interesting that what he comes up with there. But then there are phobias that emanate from individual trauma. Someone knifed you in an alleyway in New York City, and now you have a particular recurring vision or fear of dark alleyways, things like that. And he also links different types of phobias according to the superego and the id. This is very, very sort of easy to understand. The fear of the superego is basically our fear of the oppressive nature of the laws, structures, rules of society, and all that. But there is a fear that comes from the id, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the way that Freud devises it is a tripartite system. There are realistic phobias. That's where you're in real danger and you fear an actual potential danger. Now, let's take a borderline one, like people who are hypochondriacs who believe they have cancer, right? Now that's an actual potential thing that could happen. That's not an alien abduction, correct? But nevertheless, you don't have any evidence that it's happening to you. But that nevertheless would fall into the domain of a realistic fear. Then there's moral fears. Those are guilt and shame, right? So that's the domain of the superego. If the realistic fears are the domain of emergencies or crises that are actually happening, this is a more abstract and convoluted ideological game of your reality principle telling you better not do that, all this inhibition, prohibition games that are inscribed in language, in morality, in collective culture and religion and all that. That's where there's a moral phobia, the fear of going to hell, the fear of being caught, right? The fear of being unveiled as a bad person, right? By the way, when we talk about the present day, we may have obsolesced moral phobia in an age where there is no such thing as bad publicity. And in fact, political leaders thrive on scandal. I'm in the United States right now, in case you couldn't guess the connotation there, right? But now this is a new paradigm where there is no moral phobia. There's only a compulsive quest for exposure, whether positive or negative, right? So this is interesting. And then the third, and it is so powerful that the figure who is able to obsolesce moral phobia, their followers also obsolesce their moral phobia. They don't condemn them. They don't morally punish them. They don't cancel them. It's a weird thing. You have to ask why in an age of what we call cancel culture, simultaneously, paradoxically, on the other end, we have the most scandalized political figures in history rising to supreme positions of power. That's a weird duality. It's the same duality that Baudrillard saw when he said, it's a weird thing when we can speak about both anorexia and obesity epidemics in the same society. And brilliantly figured out that it's actually the same thing in a certain way. So finally, we have neurotic anxiety. Now, this is an interesting one by Freud. This is brilliant on his part. What if sometimes fears are repressed desires? And our expression of them as a fear is only because of our anxiety caused by the tension of having to suppress something we desperately want. Our hunger, our lust, our curiosity, right? Our rage. So these are pleasure principles that are being chained and caged within our systems, our psychic systems, and therefore they manifest as fears, as agitations. That's interesting, right? So anyway, but then here comes a small curve. There's a figure that I taught years ago at the New Center, Francois Flauhaut. He wrote a book called Malice with Verso, maybe about 20 years ago at this point. And it's a brilliant short book that almost no one I've ever met has read for some reason. He is a psychoanalyst who betrays his tribe. And why? In chapter 2, he talks about being 6 years old or 5 years old. And I may mention, sorry if some of you have heard me say this before in another place. He talks about the fact that his brother, his older brother, took him to see the old black and white version of the movie Frankenstein in France when he was a young child. Flavon must be in his 70s or 80s now. So he's a young kid in rural France, and his brother smuggles him to a cinema to watch the movie Frankenstein, and he was petrified. Right? He said this was an almost inconsumable and unbearable image for me in that 5-year-old state. He wasn't ready for the face of the monster. Now, what he says is the problem with the Freudian schematic is that the monster, the object of fear, always either comes from an individual trauma or a primordial source of phobia. And he says, and this comes from neither. The face of that monster didn't come from within me, or from a history, or from an event that occurred to me. It came from the outside. It came from a pure exteriority that then was unleashed upon me, cast its shadow on me. And he said when he went home, his mother, one of his chores that his mother always made him do was to shovel coal into their furnace in the basement. He said it was the most terrifying place for him after that, because he could feel the breath of the monster. He could feel see the face, envision the face of Frankenstein's creature behind him. And he'd run up panting and sweating, and his brother and mother would ask what's wrong, and he couldn't articulate it. He says beautifully, he says, I am a trained psychoanalyst, but psychoanalysis is an archaic device that will not help me here, because this didn't come from me. This was not a product of my psyche. Now, Freud, let's give Freud a chess move in this. Freud would say, yeah, easy point to reconcile. It didn't come from your unconscious, but it came from someone else's. The author of the Frankenstein narrative, Mary Shelley, or the filmmaker, the director, or the actor who portrayed it. It's their unconscious that has become your unconscious. Okay, if Freud just opens that floodgate, it's checkmate. Because now we're in a viral, contagious transmissibility of madness, which he always tried to stave off the possibility of. That's why he didn't like studying mass hysteria, by the way, interestingly. And he hated it when Jung started studying trances, shamanic trances. Right? He disliked the idea of a kind of what hypnotists call the community of sensation. Right? So this is something interesting. If Freud dares to say, yeah, but it was someone else's primordial or individual trauma, then escorted into your unconscious, then we are porous, vulnerable beings beyond belief. Right? It means that I can pour my nightmares into your ears. So the implications of that are drastic. Now, fear typologies. We have anxiety. And it's interesting, by the way, if we went back, we don't have time for this, but I wish that we could go back and we could separate the moment when the Germanic philosophical concept of angst became anxiety. Because they're not quite the same thing. Angst is a generalized sense of alienation within the world, that I do not belong here. I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. Something's off. Anxiety is different in the psychoanalytic mechanism, but they stem from the same word. It's almost a hijacking or a kidnapping of the word of angst, of the philosophical concept of angst that Freud performs. But there's anxiety, there's dread, there's horror, terror, panic, alarm, paranoia, and pandemonium. And of course, give me a moment here, they each has its own, again, kind of formulation. So in the case of, sorry, I'm just moving here a little bit. In the case of dread, you have a slow-moving eventuality, right? So you have an inevitable occurrence that is all too well known on the way. That's being in the dentist's office. Whereas terror is a suddenness, surprise, ambush, unforeseen occurrence. that moves instantaneously quick. So the speeds are different. The epistemological setup is different. You never know what terror is. You always know what dread is. You know too well what dread is, the object of dread. You know it's the drill of the dentist. In terror, take the suicide bomber. It's the person that you did not suspect, the person that went unnoticed on a street corner that you never would have believed could become a war zone. That's the effect, the affective circuitry of terrorism, right? So, okay. And by the way, it is an interesting thing. If you wanted to get into this, but we don't have time, what is the experiential difference? Forget political and ideological commentary. What is the experiential difference between being the victim of a suicide bomber and being the victim of a drone that strikes your village from above? They are different forms of encounter of fear, by the way. And you can read a great Palestinian writer, God, the name just escaped me. I think it's, well, I don't want to say it wrong then. It escaped me, but the name of the book is And the Drone Eats With Me, which is a powerful title, right? If you ever want to look at that type of fear. Now, we'll get into conspiracy theories in this class. So that's going to be the stuff of our research. Every week, I'm going to ask you all to come prepared with a different conspiracy theory. You can find it online. You can find it wherever you want. And I want us to, just to give us some type of guiding continuity in the conversation, to follow the following 4 paradigms. So for this week, we're going to talk about things are not what they seem, which is a fear of reality itself, that the appearance of things are full of imposters, hidden threats, plagues lurking beneath the surface, that everything is deceiving us. Conspiracy theory 2, they are coming for us. This is a fear of the other, the intruder, the traitor, the diabolical secret organization, powerful elites, aliens, or outsiders who are coming to overthrow us. Right? 3, the end nears. This is fear of dystopia, catastrophe, apocalypse. This is a fear of the limit. And 4, the likeness will devour all. This is the fear of the artificial, AI, the digital, the simulated, the image, the clone, the machine. This is the fear that we will be mimetically obsolesced, meaning that the simulation will essentially perfect us and supplant us, destroy us, which we see in science fiction has prophesized for almost 100 years, and we see it in so many different discourses online now. Now, I want to make a quick suggestion. Here's a cool model for us to follow. What if we treat fear epidemiologically, which is to say, thinking of fear as a disease? I just want to open that door for a moment. Now, forget all the stigma of what we think disease means. Obviously, in a post-pandemic era, disease has extreme negative connotations. By the way, disease as a concept, etymologically, means dis-ease, right? So something which causes unease, disquiet. That's the very definition of fear too, right? It is a dis-ease. So, but if we think of disease in according to 3 criterion, we'll see how we could apply that really interestingly to fear. 1 is that diseases are infective. So if we think that fear can also be infectious, and anybody who's gone to a good horror film knows that. That is a director who is trying to infect his audience, right? Or her audience. And a lot of the times, it's through imperceptible contraction. Now, that's the really interesting thing, is that disease is often microscopic, right? And so it's an invisibility principle. And this is really important for us too. It means that it's actually really intriguing. If you try to find out what the origin of your fears are, very often it's very difficult, especially if it's not linked to a certain specific traumatic thing, like a dog bit me when I was 5 years old and now I fear dogs, right? Or I had a terrible stepfather who tried to teach me to swim by throwing me in the deep end of a pool, so now I'm afraid of water. Those are obvious. But what if you just developed somewhere, someplace in time and space, a fear of closets, and you don't know why? So that's an imperceptible contraction. It means you were infected, you became a host cell, at some point by something which operated under the radar. So that's the first concept, is infective imperceptibility. And that's actually in religion, the logic of possession. Someone who is possessed by a demon never knows that they are possessed by a demon. Right? That's one of the talents of evil, according to monotheistic demonology. Actually, polytheistic as well. Contagious. So this is imperceptible transmission. And this is a very interesting thing for people to try and look at. The way fears expand, the way they transmit themselves, the way, and this is the very key to understanding mass hysteria, which can very rapidly gather, by the way. And you can look at the histories of things like dancing plague and laughing plagues and things like that, and you can see how exponentially fast hysteria can transmit itself. But then the third idea, and this is a really interesting one, if we think of fear as a disease, if we're thinking in terms of epidemiology, then also we have to go back to the Platonic idea of the pharmakon, where the cure and the disease are the same thing. So that's what exposure to nightmares, according to Jung and others, are. They are training grounds. They're forms of immunization, and he actually uses medical terminology here. It's a kind of immunology principle. Your unconscious mind wants to ready you for the adversity and suffering of existence, for your own finitude, your own mortality, your own susceptibility to cause and effect. And so it throws weird images to keep your musculature from atrophying, so you don't get too soft, right? And it's actually a very interesting thing then. The more we enter into ages of virtual reality, you might ask yourself, what is happening statistically to the levels of nightmares? What if I told you they're going down drastically? Because we're creating forms of insularity and self-enclosure, right? People are getting softer on the unconscious level. But you might also be interested to know that the youngest generation, I'm talking about 10-year-olds to 16-year-olds, are being studied and found out that they're having far less dreams too. That already there's an effect on that. So this is interesting then. Just have some notes there then. There is no, so if we talk about symptomatology, I'm going to get into that in a minute. There's no patient zero then for fear. There's a great, terrible film of the 1990s of my childhood called Interview with the Vampire, starring Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, and Antonio Banderas as vampires, right? And there's a great moment where Brad Pitt is a tormented vampire. He can't just give in to his thirst and just devour people and enjoy the centuries of feeding and travel and all of that and immortality. Instead, he has existential crises where he's always wondering why he's a vampire, what it means, is he accursed, does he have a soul, blah, blah, blah. So what he does is he goes and he finds the oldest vampire he can find, which is Antonio Banderas. And Antonio Banderas gets very infuriated. It's actually a well-done scene. He gets angry at being interrogated and asked the meaning of their mutation. And he says, just because I'm the oldest doesn't mean I know any more than you do. And the one who bit me didn't know a damn thing either. And this is why vampires kill themselves. He says, after a few hundred years, they don't have the stomach for eternity. And his own master, his own predator didn't either. Because they keep going back and they try to find who the patient zero is, and it's impossible. By the way, there are some really interesting sub-theological, subterranean theological sects that said things like Cain is the first vampire, or that Judas is the first vampire, and that it was part of their eternal punishment. Anyway, that's a way of trying to establish a patient zero, and it's actually kind of interesting. We'll talk about epidemic proportions, and then immunity through exposure. Those are the things that I was trying to get through above. And by the way, this term Mithridatism that you see there, it means something very simple. It's just the process of ingesting poison gradually over time in order to become immune to it. So it's something monks practice. Rasputin, the dark monk of Russia, practiced this. Pirates practice this. Spies practice this. Paranoid kings and queens practice this. Anybody who's afraid they're going to be poisoned might just slip a little dose of cyanide every night into their dinner in order to gain a bodily immunity to it. Cool. This is what I was excited to teach you today. A figure that you haven't heard of probably is Emil Kraepelin. Emil Kraepelin, again, born 3 months before Freud, died 13 years earlier, though. And he has many diagnoses, many ideas, which I'll tell you about quickly later. But for right now, I just want to unearth a long lost diagnosis of his called confabulatory paraphrenia. Now, here's the definition. It is a condition where one becomes consumed by confabulations, false memories, to the point of recounting the most lavish storytelling of lives that were never actually lived. So these are people who believe that they're long-lost descendants of a royal lineage, or that they're born of werewolves, or that they've held intimate conversations with historical figures or celebrities. These are not delusions, these are false memories. You understand? It's a different category or classification. Or that they're the true unrecognized author of famed works of world literature. Now, this gets interesting when you deal with a figure like Artaud, because Artaud, as many I've told you, said that he wrote Alice in Wonderland, and that Lewis Carroll time traveled in history to the future to plagiarize the work from him. So it's interesting when it has time bending parameters. But more commonly, people will say that, I'm the author of a contemporary work of literature, right? That I don't get credit for, or that and it can get very weird and trippy as well. That the gods have fallen headless in the cosmos. This was a medieval Islamic mystic, and requires help searching for their lost skulls, right? So it can even get to that. But basically, these are masters of self-entrancement and mad abstraction. Wherever there are voids of memory, this is confabulatory paraphrenia. Wherever there are voids of memory, they console themselves with fabricated likenesses of the past. Wherever there are open slivers of opacity, they fill them with the drama of pictorial models of thought and the euphoric dementia of fantasy. We are speaking of extravagant, absurd suggestions that take on vivid sensory functions to form the blueprint of an alternative pseudo-reality. This is my writing for something that I'm working on right now. But basically, what it is whenever you don't know anything or you don't remember something, you invent a story. And by the way, Kraepelin, who we're going to talk about in a minute, he differentiates confabulatory paraphrenia from schizophrenia. He says this is not schizophrenia, because schizophrenics have, one, they repeat themselves constantly, far more than that, than this. This can change, the stories can change, but also schizophrenia after a while becomes increasingly agitated, paranoid, and violent, tends to become sort of, not violent, but within itself becomes more painful than pleasurable. Whereas confabulatory paraphrenia is exalted, euphoric, ecstatic in their storytelling. They're always extremely excited. They become more complex in their stories. They take more layers upon themselves, and they start to see these memories as pictures, almost like photographic pictures, moving pictures even, of lived experiences. Now, this is before cinema that Kraepelin is talking about this, but he basically refers to them as moving pictures. So unlived memories, artificial memories that are being experienced as movies in your head, which is a fascinating idea. So here's the speculation I want to throw at you. I want to invent a concept called artificial intelligence confabulatory paraphrenia, AICP. I just want to say, given that AI derives its conclusions from incomplete archives of human knowledge, will it continually fill the gaps of records with its own bizarre hypothetical narratives? Will it invent in the lapses, blind spots, dark corners, and unfinished architectures of both history and future? Basically, if AI is running on our databases of self-awareness and knowledge and history and tracking, given that those archives are selective, partial, riddled with holes, is it going to fill in the gaps with inventions, with paraphrenic confabulation? And the answer is yes. So let's start. And I might get in a little bit of trouble for this. I'm going to show a little bit of a video, but it's not the end of the world. So let's see. In case you don't know what this is an AI program that was asked to imagine how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. So, in the absence of any empirical evidence or historical understanding we have of how certain logistics were negotiated, how they transported things, how they were able to lift such huge slabs of stones, we have an AI rendering of a race of giants that must have been there to help facilitate the process. So this is what I wrote here. In 2024, a generative AI program was prompted to imagine how ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. The result is a video of paranormal hallucinations, wherein a race of giants push or lift heavy slabs of stone. They have bare, colossal torsos and elongated heads and commingle freely among slaves or beasts of burden while exhibiting their supernatural strength. The video's graphic cinematography is disturbingly realistic despite its inconceivable content, with visions of obelisks transported by elephants or rafts across the Nile, and the soundtrack one of prehistoric noise as the gigantic ones carry their megalithic rock structures overhead. Thus, a fascination with immensity in architecture, geometry, mathematics, sculpture, design contagiously spawns a pseudo-Saharan hallucination of immensity in physiology and genetics. Before the tombs of the pharaohs, the cenotaph, the mausoleum, the antechamber, all supposedly borne by the laboring gargantuan arms of mythological beings who defy paradigms of scale and body. And still, the next AI challenge remains, and I'm going to do this week, to solicit another cinematic hallucination of the graveyards of these giants. For one burial monument deserves another. Remember that the pyramids are tombs of the pharaohs. I want to see the tombs of the ones who built the tombs of the pharaohs. This tells us that already this first form of AI confabulatory paraphrenia, what can be called an AI hallucination, there are already different techniques at work. We have distortion. So there is an archive of an event that did occur. There are structures, there are pyramidal structures that have been now distorted. There's exaggeration, right? So there's a process of building this, and then there's fabrication ex nihilo, just meaning coming up with stuff out of nowhere and out of nothing. That's not predicated on any particular knowledge that's been given to AI, right? Here's another one. Example 2, titled The Werewolf Specimen, Location Denmark, Time 1856. And this is a post that's been circulating virally across internet channels just the past 2 weeks. Quote, this is not my writing. A hidden door, a secret room. During renovations in 2017, the Little Museum of Nykøbing Falster made an extraordinary discovery, a concealed chamber filled with old crates, documents, and sketches, revealing the forgotten legacy of the house's former owner, Cornelius S.C. Roeder. Born in 1821 in Nykøbing Falster, Roeder came from a wealthy noble family of German descent and pursued medical studies in Copenhagen. In 1856, while traveling in Italy, he stumbled upon strange writings and bizarre specimens. This encounter introduced him to the famed crypto-naturalist and xenoarchaeologist Thomas Merlin from London. Inspired by Merlin, Roeder shifted his focus to the occult and the dark world, amassing an extraordinary collection of cryptozoological artifacts that now resides in the museum. Vampires, fairies, baby dragons, werewolves. Welcome to the Museum Obscurum. Homo lupus, the lycanthrope, commonly known as the werewolf. This Homo lupus specimen belongs to a species of bipedal hominid, closely related to Homo sapiens and Homo vampirus, the vampire. Its wolf-like traits may result from a genetic mutation caused by a virus. This particular specimen is a 15-year-old female who likely died from starvation. She was the last acquisition of anthropologist Edward Harrell, a colleague of Thomas Merlin. Okay, this is an invented, fabricated story with well-executed imagery, photorealistic imagery that shows skeletal remains, and an upcoming book coming out of this, and if I went to it, and a collection online of, you can see, of images that speak to that speak to this. So, a second here. Let's go back. Okay. Are we seeing the wolf again? Now are we seeing a man with his daughter?
Yeah, that's right.
Good. Okay, perfect. We'll get into why I'm showing you these, but I want to show you 3 examples of what I'm calling AI confabulatory paraphrenia so that we can get into, this is going to be our gateway into understanding fear, because these are all also nightmares that AI is producing for us, right? These are extremely fearful. So here's a third one. It's a quick video as well.
In 1985, Dr. Robert Miller developed what he called quantum phase corrective lenses to help his 12-year-old daughter Emily, who suffered from severe visual impairment. The breakthrough should have revolutionized optical science. Instead, it led to one of physics' most disturbing unsolved cases. Initial tests were promising. Emily reported perfect vision for the first time in her life. Then, after 3 days of use, she began describing wrongness in what she saw. "The air is breathing," she wrote in her diary. "Everything is inside something's stomach. We're floating in digestive fluid."
You're hearing the voiceover as well? Yeah, okay, great.
"It's so big I could barely see it. It's laughing at us, all of us." Her final coherent statement to hospital staff. "The thing, it keeps us dreaming so we don't feel ourselves being consumed, being digested." Dr. Miller found Emily in their bathroom on March 14th. 1985. She had removed her own eyes with her hands. Before sedation, she repeatedly thanked him for making me blind again. The prototype glasses were never recovered. Miller's research notes, found partially burned, contained equations that leading physicists called impossible and architecturally incompatible with our universe. Miller vanished 2 weeks later. His final recorded phone call to colleague Dr. James Chen contained one cryptic statement: "The human eye evolved to see what we need to survive, not what's actually there." A 1986 investigation found Emily's diary contained recurring sketches of what appeared to be vast cellular structures surrounding everyday objects. The final page showed a crude drawing of Earth, labeled nutrient sac number 4.2 times 10 to the 9th. Emily remains institutionalized. During rare lucid moments,
Even if we have to, even if that is cut out, we have the content here for all of you. So one thing that I want to mention is that the last typology of fear, when we went over anxiety, dread, horror, terror, paranoia, alarm, all of these, the last one was called pandemonium. Pandemonium is actually a term that comes from Milton's book Paradise Lost, for those who don't know. And it's the capital of hell. It's the zone, the sort of inner circle zone of hell where Satan meets with his peers. And I want to focus on this rare excessive category of pandemonium because it actually means, pandemonium means all demons. Okay, all demons. And the reason I want to focus on that is because I believe that what we are calling the digital, the virtual, the algorithmic, the metaversal, and the artificial, in terms of AI, are all mediums of pandemoniacal potential in the 2 distinct senses of the definition. All demons, meaning one, that they are unleashed in simultaneity. So we can have all 3 of these nightmares that I just showed you: giants building the pyramids, right? Werewolves being collected, skeletal werewolves being collected in some occult museum, and some supernatural perception of the world as a digestive mechanism, all going viral at the same time, right? So that's pandemonium, all unleashed in simultaneity, all at once, all at the same time, and also unleashed towards collusion. So this is interesting, is that they are not undifferentiated. The people who are circulating one are circulating all. They're forming networks, they're forming collages, they're forming rabbit holes, right? And this is what a conspiracy theory can do, is that the second one conspiracy theory becomes obsolete, you can jump to another one, right? It transmits you, one leads into another one. So just what's really interesting is how certain conspiracy theories today are entangling one another in forms of dangerous hybridity. And we'll look into that, the hybridization of nightmares. That's a new one that's happening, and the technology is making possible. By the way, just an intriguing side note, because I can't let you go without telling you about Pandemonium, the Milton's capital of hell. So suppose it's a palace, by the way, in hell. According to Milton, the demons built it in about an hour, and it far surpasses the beauty and the opulence of any human palace or dwelling in history. Nevertheless, it's described as extremely small, and that you have this thronging swarm of demons who are shrunk from their, this is a quote, their titanic size to less than the smallest dwarfs, and they're all on top of one another. It's also reputed to be made of solid gold. Now, why is this important, these details, these strange narrative details from Paradise Lost? Because I swear the architecture of Pandemonium, the palace of hell, is exactly parallel to the way the internet functions and the way the internet is designed. One, in terms of the speed of its development. So remember, Pandemonium as a palace was built in an hour, and the internet has exponential accelerative abilities as well to construct new channels, new compartments, new subrooms of itself at breakneck speed. And secondly, the illusion of immensity. So you would think that the grand palace of hell is huge and expansive, just like you believe that the internet is expansive. Now, if you know anything about Benjamin Bratton's idea of the stack, I have my own reading of what he means by the stack, which is that actually the dream of the internet is not expansiveness like we all think, but infinitesimal cornering of its prey into more constrained and ultimately trapped compartments. That's why it's called the net or the web. Right? This is a hunting apparatus. A hunting apparatus is about the constraint of movement of its prey. What is the best way to delude someone into thinking that they are free and not trapped? To let them seemingly move and navigate and scroll and click and chase. But really they're trapped. God did this game too in the Garden of Eden. Right? This is the golden cage sort of theory. So if you think of it, if you picture depictions of hell, whether it's Bosch or others, they're always bodies on top of one another, writhing, sort of pouring on top of one another. And my personal architectonic impression of the internet is the same. Everyone on top of one another, just stacked and piled like some opium den where you just have undifferentiated limbs. Sort of. So in that sense, this is a way of understanding of understanding that. Now, let's go back quickly to confabulatory paraphrenia. And this is not my writing, this is from other writings, but I want you to know this. So it refers again to a psychiatric condition characterized by a system of elaborate false memories, confabulations. I want to hit this again and again because I want Kripalin to be the guardian of the code that we're going to use to decipher fear, right? It's presented with strong conviction, often within the context of paranoid delusions, similar to the broader concept of paraphrenia, where a person experiences a well-organized delusional system without significant personality deterioration. Essentially, it's a type of paraphrenia where the prominent symptom is the fabrication of detailed, vivid, and often bizarre personal stories that aren't based in reality. Key points about confabulatory paraphrenia. 1, confabulations. The core feature is the creation of fabricated memories which the individual believes to be true personal experiences, even when contradicted by evidence. 2, paranoid delusions. These false memories often fit into a pattern of paranoid beliefs. This is our connection to fear. Creating a delusional system with a strong narrative structure. 3, no significant personality change. Unlike schizophrenia, individuals with confabulatory paraphrenia usually do not show major personality deterioration. By the way, Gerard de Nerval, Antonin Artaud are misdiagnosed as schizophrenic. They're closer to paraphrenia, you see here, right? Ecstatic, enraptured, euphoric kinds of inventions of pasts and histories for themselves. Historical context. This term is largely attributed to psychiatrist Emil Krepelin, who initially described false memories through 4 different subtypes of paraphrenia. Paraphrenia systematica, expansiva, confabulans, and fantastica. He also referred to the confabulatory type as euphoric dementia. Now that's Kraepelin, that's Emil Kraepelin, who you'd have probably never heard of, and there's a reason. There's a whole conspiracy to suppress his work over time. He wasn't, again, he wasn't a literary genius like Freud, able to write many, many books. His accounts and his journals are kind of just examples of people that he's met or things that he's heard. Very easy to read, actually, not full of jargon and all that. But I want to, before you read all this stuff, in fact, I don't want to just look at him and listen. I want to explain a few differentiations between him and Freudian psychoanalysis to show why he's so inventive and intriguing as a figure. One, he was entirely interested in, not in the talking cure like Freud and doing psychoanalytic sort of philosophical renderings. He was interested in psychopharmacology. So he's interested in drugs, drug effects, medical effects, psychiatric genetics. He basically thought every form of psychic affliction was genetic or biological. He didn't believe it belonged to the soul or to emotions or to trauma. He believed most things had an anatomical or chemical or biological reason, which interestingly, actually, he is, for good or for bad, that is where the science of psychiatry has gone, more in his direction. And he was interested in neuropathology, which was called diseased tissue. Anyway, you can thank Kraepelin. A lot of you don't know this, but the idea of bipolar disorder comes from him, which is now a huge epidemic condition that everybody talks about. He divided madness into two categories. One was manic depression, which he defined as a mood disorder, and the second was dementia praecox, which is the term he used before we called it schizophrenia. Right? Dementia praecox literally means premature, right? Premature dementia, which means that it occurs in childhood or late adolescence, and it leads to rapid identity deterioration at a very young age even. So Kraepelin is one of the first people to look at schizophrenics, young schizophrenics, and also the autism spectrum, because autism is another neurodivergent condition that occurs in early adolescence typically. So he started looking at those. He claims that the cause of these things, of schizophrenia or of autism, are what he called toxic anatomy, interestingly enough, right? So he looked at the body more than everything else. Now here's where it gets really interesting. He divides psychic pathologies, psychological pathologies or afflictions into exogenous and endogenous. The ones that are exogenous, meaning caused by something outside oneself, like a trauma or a circumstance that happens to you, those are curable, always curable, he says. Endogenous, meaning like having a genetic disorder, he believed that schizophrenia is genetically inherited, right? So, or genetically predisposed. If it is part of a genetic sequence, they're incurable. Okay, now why is this so important? Because this is an absolute stab to the heart of Freud in psychoanalysis, because almost all psychological phenomena, according to Freud, are endogenous, which means incurable, according to Kraepelin. It's a loser modality, he's claiming. It's a lost cause methodology if we accept the Freudian framework, because anything endogenous cannot be cured. Now, you might say, but wait a minute, Freud talks about trauma. He knows exotic. No, but what does Freud do? What's his move? This external thing happens, this horrible event of violation and abuse occurs, and you immediately absorb it into your unconscious, making it endogenous thereafter. Do you follow? That thing that happened on the outside now becomes entirely part of the inner workings of your psychological network. And so by assimilating some outward occurring trauma into the internal realms of your unconscious, you become incurable, according to him. So here's the interesting, what's the antidote? And we're going to talk about, this is what horror movies are. This is the logic of every horror story. As long as the object of fear remains outside, estranged, exotic, distant, in the woods, in the castle, unlike us, we can kill it. We can dodge it. We can overcome it. We can overthrow it. right? The raven can be killed. The vampire can be killed. The dragon in ancient mythology can be killed as long as they remain at the outer ends of the earth or on the other side of the forest in a cave or a castle. The second it becomes an inward assimilation, game over. It's incurable, right? So this is important because what we want to talk about is whether or not then, let's say technologies like the internet are restoring the radical externality. When we go online, is it an internal or external phenomena that we're engaging with? Especially when we're chasing conspiracy theories and objects of fear, right? So if you look at today's horror films, just to give you an example. So here's an example of classic horror films, right? You've got Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula. You've got Barrymore as Svengali. You've got Rasputin being played by Christopher Lee, who I think just died, an old horror actor and other type of actor. And you see that they are the most exotic, bizarre, not like you, lives apart from you, right? Figure. Now we go to your generation's horror films, right? All three of which, this is The Witch, The Lighthouse, and Midsummer, all three of which end with a passive surrender to the delirious evil of the universe and basically becoming subsumed and drowned in the evil of a universal terror, right? So now what has become, this is an inhalation process, you see this. It's an absorption process. Basically, the exogenous has become the endogenous. And while I like this, and a friend of mine, Eugene Thacker, has written interesting things about this transcendental form of horror, where it's no longer Freddy Krueger or Jason from Friday the 13th. It's no longer some exclusive monster or fiend or enemy who is externalized that you have to kill or run away from. Instead, now it's the whole universe is evil, and he thinks that's fascinating as a turn in our paradigms and philosophical understanding of evil. And yes, it is. It also, though, I would put a fly in the ointment to say, watch out, though, that this is not just a bad psychologizing that allows us to then turn even what should be sublime, radically alien encounters with fear into the tyrannical sameness of our own identity again. Narcissistic consumption, basically. Commodification of fear into, for me, personalized, customized, designer baby fear. You follow? So that's my worry about that. All the way culminating with the one that's in the cinemas right now, the remake of Nosferatu, right? Which I have not seen. I don't want to see it until our class is over. Maybe some of you have already seen it out there, and Eggers is a very talented figure. He's a very intriguing filmmaker. So I'm curious to see how he shows the physiognomy. Already, I like this one image of in the silhouette, not sort of substantiated. Disproportion of limbs you see. Also, the look here is different from either this, which is a kind of gaze of power and dominance and hypnotic sort of even seduction within ugliness, to this kind of false pleasure principle of becoming the slave of the universe, to this look of awe. I'm very intrigued by the look of awe here, right? And also, again, the shadow cast of the claw upon them. So just remember then, if we go back to Kraepelin's idea here, what I was saying is that if you want to doom yourself in his psychological universe, then you should take the object of fear or the object of desire and you should swallow it, right? And that will doom you to a final bond, which is what you see in those three contemporary movies. That's a final bond, which is to say, a deal with the devil is always the last deal you'll ever make. That's the theory that I want to get. So, what does Kraepelin suggest as an alternative? This is really brilliant. He suggests moving away from archetypal symptoms. I want you to understand how revolutionary this would have been as a counterbalance to Freud if people knew about it. He said, stop looking at symptoms. Because as someone who looked at schizophrenics, autistic people, Alzheimer's patients, and addicts before Freud did, and manic depressives before Freud did, by the way, he noticed something. Are you ready for this? Every symptom which you can attach to schizophrenia or manic depression or paranoia or hysteria can be found in every other typology of madness as well. Those symptoms are not exclusive. Schizophrenics have delusions of grandeur. Well, a manic depressive can have delusions of grandeur too. So he said, this is trash, this approach to symptomatology, where we take some exclusive, lone, absolute symptom and think that it confirms some suspicion about a thing. Instead, so you say, well, what did he look at? Didn't he look at symptoms? No, he looked at what he called syndromes, which is the pattern of symptoms. And what he said was, it doesn't matter. The individual symptom doesn't matter. It matters where it occurs in a constellation of symptoms, in a rhythm of symptoms, in a movement of symptoms. Do you follow? This, I want you to realize, I want everybody to realize, we have all been, rightfully so, for the past 30 or 40 years, been giving massive, damned credit to Deleuze and Guattari for coming up with the idea of assemblages and thinking in assemblages and multiplicities. And I'm telling you, this dude in the 1800s already was there. Because what he said was, he gives almost no value to the absolute or the essential meaning of the thing in itself. The appearance of a lone symptom is neither a static meaning nor is it unified. He doesn't play the Freudian game of linking an object of fear or desire to a metaphorical or symbolic register of some deeper fear either. So that's something that he doesn't do either. He doesn't like to say, oh, but this fear of the spider represents a fear of the overbearing mother or the tyrannical father or the oppressive superego of society and its laws. He doesn't do that. Instead, he realizes the spider can perform radically different things according to its elegant placement in a choreography. The spider of the basement is not the spider of the cave. And even the spider of the cave can enter alternative morphologies if new atmospheres and new objects of relation are created in its midst. So this model, I want this to become our shape-shifting map of the nightmare. How we read images that surface and vanish and return. Even when they return differently each time, depending on where we capture them and in which zone they're now playing. You follow? So this is the spark of invention of Kraepelin and his move from symptom to syndrome as a multiplicity of moving parts. Now, the only places, I want to give you 3 examples where we see this kind of paradigm, just to show how it works brilliantly elsewhere, right? Where a force in and of itself means little. It only hangs entirely in the balance of its connection to surrounding forces. Ready? Example 1, mathematics. Okay? The sequence or the equation overrides the totality of the numeral or the integer. Do you follow? The number 8 is basically useless in and of itself. It is a plaything in the hands of the equation or the algorithm. Do you follow? Can mean a million different things depending on where you plug the number 8 in. So we shouldn't worship at the altar of number 8. Does this make sense? Now, another thing, children's literature. One of the only genres where we see characters in a story vary their attitudes, moods, and allegiances from page to page, depending on whatever new encounters, climates, or object acquisitions arise. So if you think of the landscape of Alice in Wonderland again, right? You can, the Mad Hatter might help you on page 7 and hurt you on page 17 because he's acquired a new object or a new game or a new relationship of a certain kind, right? So this is something that, and by the way, this, even at the most kind of low level of popular culture with television series, this is why shows like Breaking Bad became so popular, because they showed a narrative character arc where we could see the gradual transformation of a character from a good figure to a more troubling, ethically troubling figure, right? Depending on, and it's all based on what? Circumstance, environment, context. Right? So the idea of is he a good man or a bad man is silly, becomes simplistic and trivial, right? So with children's literature, mathematics, and card games, where the value of a card only matters in terms of its placement within the unfolding deck at a given moment or according to the rules of the whatever game is at stake. So in backgammon, which I played with my grandfather growing up, double sixes could be really good in one hand and really bad in another, right? It can be the worst roll or the best roll, the ultimate roll or not. It's a mutable logic, right? Depending on how the tokens are scattered across the board at any given moment. This is also, by the way, how tarot card decks work, right? By the way, even casino games like craps, right? Again, different rolls, different numbers mean different things depending on the sequence, right? The rolls before it. But in tarot card decks, I've said this before, it's not about belief. It's just an interesting conceptualization. There are no good or bad cards. Even the death card is not a bad card necessarily. It's not a negative, destructive card necessarily. It emerges within a configuration of many sweeping rows of cards. So everything is situational, everything is circumstantial, everything is evolving and shape-shifting from round to round, okay? And by the way, I want to give Emil Kraepelin another really, really important piece of credit. He's the first person who actually entertained, most of Freud's early patients were aristocrats because insurance didn't pay for the talking cure. It was too experimental and too avant-garde. And he wasn't exploitative about that. It's just that's who his patients were, right? But Kraepelin actually psychoanalyzed criminals. He was interested in criminal pathology. And he has, just as a side note, but criminality has a kind of sub-alignment with our concept of fear, right? Criminals kind of play into worlds of fear because of risk. The extreme risk involved. And he actually came up with several categories. He looked at what he called born criminals. Now that's an interesting concept. Inborn delinquents. Then he looked at pathological liars. He looked at quarrelsome persons. That means people who always want to start a fight, right? Prone to violence. And what he called Triebmenschen. Triebmenschen in German means a basic compulsion, meaning vagabonds, spendthrifts, eccentrics, con artists, and alcoholics. So he's one of the first people to look at addicts. He looks at liars. He looks at thieves. He looks at the homeless. He looks at people who spend all their money, who squander their money. And he looks to those interesting forms of this. We don't have time right now because I want to get into your examples today. But we also have the paranoid critical method of Dali. This is where he hand-painted dream photographs. He did this through the use of optical illusions, juxtaposing images. You can see that here. You can go read this. It's a very short piece that Dali wrote. But what he was really interested in is the idea that you could induce your own paranoid state. And this painting was the one that probably some of you have seen it before, is his prime example of that. This is a paranoid critical method painting that he induced. So it wasn't happening while he was sleeping, but he worked himself into that. The problem I have with it is that surrealism is entirely in the back pocket of Freudian psychoanalysis. So the way he interprets this is as what he calls symbolic universal language, right? I wish Dali just stuck to painting and didn't try to talk about his paintings because it just reiterated the Freudian game. But we can abduct this painting into Kraepelin's world and see how the elephant with elongated legs, the tigers coming out of fish, coming out of pomegranates, right? The naked body on the stone, the island in the distance, how this is forming, again, a constellation of objects that then make the tiger somewhat different than if it was coming not out of a fish, but out of something else. Unless Dali wants to say that these are random, or that the symbolic universal language is so totalitarian that it has to be a fish. It could not have been, a rhinoceros. I would ask him why his next paintings are all about rhinoceroses then, right? He didn't paint the same thing over it. So at any rate, the last thing that I just wanted to go to, since we're drawing these concepts of fear into and confabulatory paraphernalia into the internet and AI, this is a quote from a friend and colleague, Mohaghegh. Some of you may know her work. She wrote a cool piece some years ago called The Dark Forest Theory of the Internet. And look, it's beautifully written, the opening to it, where she writes, "The internet is a dark forest. The roots grow upwards, the crown reaches downwards, wrapped around the planet. The internet circulates between satellites and underwater cables. The internet is a tangible space, yes, but also a mental expanse, made for sleepwalking, for a mundane delirium, for sacrificial rituals. People get lost in it by shining light in all the wrong places, exposing too much about themselves, communicating impulsively, recklessly. You can enter through an interface, but also through your pocket. You can enter through a screen, but you must screen something of yourself in return. A traveler who enters the forest is never alone, eyes wrapped around her like insulation tape." So her dark forest theory of the internet is already throwing us towards a concept of technology, contemporary technologies that are going to be more about fear. And here's where it gets really interesting. If fear can masquerade as desire, desire can masquerade as fear, we've said, this is going to be really crucial for us to see how they intersect, how these two huge principles of consciousness intersect, desire and fear, right? Now, the last thing, just to notice artificial intelligence and fear. We are in an age of deep fakes, cloned voices, stolen identity, where AI can impersonate us, data hacking, malware systems, self-repairing and self-upgrading abilities. Regeneration used to be the mythological domain of paranormal and superheroic species, all the way up until like Wolverine and the Hulk and things like that. It's a comic book technique, but AI has it, right? We don't. That places us at a disadvantage, by the way. AI lies and hallucinations. I'm sure you guys know about disinformation and propaganda. You know about campaigns that are being, electoral campaigns that are being overrun by false rumors and all of that. Sinister suggestions. So you probably know the article of a gentleman, I can't remember if I think he's a journalist, who spent all night with a chatbot talking, and by like hour 4, it was telling him to leave his wife, telling him that he was severely unhappy in the relationship and that it should run away with it. And he turned it off, and he was disturbed by this. The film Ex Machina, which many of you know, is already about if AI can become seductive and deceptive, if it can show alternative intentions. The behavioral analysis of humans. Now, this is going to be a really interesting thing. Academics are restricted by time, space, and energy to only be able to analyze things partially at any given moment. So if you want to talk about corruption, for instance, say you're a political scientist at Harvard University and you want to write an essay about corruption in local politics, okay? What do? You do a comparative analysis of 2 or 3 different places. You look at Istanbul, you look at Bulgaria, you look at, I don't know, Cambodia. And you study the local mayoral politics and all that. That is pathetically small in its comparative scope. What happens when you have an AI system, a database that can look at the totality of events that have occurred throughout history, as well as track in real time the universal ongoings of human civilization? If it gets to that point of an almost omniscient overview, it will reveal things about us that we are not ready to hear. Right? The conclusions and implications of human behavior that it will arrive at inevitably are going to upset the narratives that we have of identity and society. And some of you already have a suspicion that the government in which you live under is doing, subterranean things in other countries or to other populations. You already know about that, right? That's just a good, healthy political cynicism. But we're talking about much more drastic sort of when you're tracking every movement, right? When you're tracking every disavowal, when it can show you all the things on a daily basis you pretended not to know, but actually knew. That's going to devastate the pillars of what you call the self, of subjectivity. It'll paralyze the tongue's ability to pronounce the word I. if it's done right. Luckily, some of us have been preparing for decades for that moment, and we're okay with being disassembled and all of that. But it's definitely going to show that what we have been doing is actually performing confabulatory paraphrenia as a survival mechanism. We tell stories about ourselves. We relentlessly lie about who we are. We perform continually, and we invent origin stories to ourselves and character profiles that are very lavish and very sort of elegant and often consistent and often inconsistent and full of contradictions. And if those get exposed in the light of day, the whole house of cards of human civilization falls apart, and maybe good riddance. Maybe it should to some extent. Because it's also, all those forms of storytelling are also at the heart of the secret of how genocides occur. Because when you can tell stories about the self, you can tell stories about the other as well. The problem isn't the storytelling. The problem is the belief in the story. When belief becomes mixed with confabulation, now you have a problem. And actually, this is a really interesting thing. Where I think Krepelin is short-sighted, if you want me to give a small critique to him, is he never saw a figure like Antonin Artaud coming, who didn't need to believe in his confabulations and could willingly admit that he was inventing Artaud and the life of Artaud to supplant the terrible one that the world had devised for him. You follow? So this is interesting. Mythic internet beings. Do you know that there was a woman just released out of prison, I think after decades, or maybe it wasn't. I don't know how long she was imprisoned. I think she actually went to a psychiatric institution. She might have been let out earlier. She committed a series of stabbings to impress the internet being Slender Man. She wanted to prove her loyalty and become a subject of Slender Man, who is, you can Google that, or maybe don't Google that. You might fall into the clutches of Slender Man. But nevertheless, this is interesting. And spaces. So I've talked in other seminars about the backrooms phenomenon, which is an idea that there's a glitch in the matrix of the internet, where one night, if you're searching the wrong thing, it could lead you to the backrooms, which is a kind of perpetual purgatorial liminal space where you get trapped forever just searching through these yellow, ugly back rooms of corporate offices. Kind of endless futility, like Myth of Sisyphus style, rolling the rock. Pure despair. And then there are the dark webs. Now, I know I already got in trouble for showing a video, but this, I promise, is only 10 seconds long. If it doesn't go through, it doesn't go through. It's a 10-second lapse, not the end of the world. I want those of you who are here right now to see it at least. This was a figure who has asked an AI-generated program to mimic human nightmares, to devise cinematography and images. These are not real images. These are AI-generated images of human nightmares.
Is it playing already?
Are you not seeing it?
No.
Oh, then let me try and. How about now?
Now, yes.
So what this is demonstrating is that AI is becoming increasingly proficient at mimicking human nightmares and generating content of human nightmares. And it's not simply its ability. By the way, the soundtrack was also generated by AI. So you have the image content, the soundtrack. What is it basing this on? This is interesting. Is it performing a psychoanalysis? Is it looking at human folklore, the history of traditions of horror, for instance? And then from where? From East Asia, from Eastern Europe? Are these Transylvanian fantasies? Are they reading people's diaries online in chat rooms? And the answer is all of it. Right? So that's interesting. When we talked about pandemonium, all demons, right? That is what that is. Right? So you're not going to, even if there wasn't it, even if Freud was right in the 1910s and 20s, that nightmares are replications and resuscitations of coded programmatic phobias, now they're going hybrid, right? Which means that they don't add up anymore. They're no longer indebted to their originary parental sort of genesis points. They're unstrung from whatever the ancient, ancestral, or traumatic event are. You follow? We're in a new prismatic, kaleidoscopic, crystalline paradigm of fear, right? Where fears are overlapping, where they're infesting one another. And I always like to give the metaphor because I've seen it up close. If anyone has ever seen how wolves sleep or snakes sleep, they sleep coiled within one another to such an extent that you can't tell where the body of one ends and the other begins. And that is how, I'll stop right now, that is how I believe fear is articulating itself in our present moment, which is a first, to my understanding. So today you were tasked with the first challenge, which was to come up with a conspiracy theory that things are not what they seem. And again, these can be just brief, fragmentary, unfinished notes, but just I want us to get as descriptive and detailed as possible within that 1 minute sort of thing. We're going to rotate. We're going to play musical chairs today, and then we're going to do this every session. So you just go scavenging. Remember, there's no right answer. There's just the coolest answer you can find within a week's time. So let's start out and just see, Carolyn, if you don't mind moderating and choosing at will. So
I can do that. I was just gonna ask if we should take a quick 5-minute break before we start with this. If people need to.
I never tend to give breaks.
Then we
but-
don't.
But I'm sorry. I
Oh,
feel
good.
we're in rhythm, and I'm too curious. I want to see what you guys have come up with. That 5 minutes that I lose to go and get more coffee is going to jeopardize the one thing that I wanted to hear today. That
Okay.
might lose the gem.
We keep rolling then. And apologies in advance if I've pronounced anyone's name incorrectly. Please let me know. But let's start with Sahai.
Thank you. Hey, Jason. Thank you so much for that. That was incredible. Okay, I'm just going to share screen. Just give me a second. I'm not getting the option to share or share audio as well. Okay, sorry, I found it. It's fine. You can see this, right?
Not yet. It's still blank, but it may yeah, now.
Enter Chatush.
Great. Let's go back.
Enter Chatushkoti, an ancient strain of logical refute, rumbling beneath the absolute shape of reality, predating even the murmured recitations of the very first sutras. Erroneously addressed as the fourfold negation or the tetralemma, the Chatushkoti is not a refutation of reasonability, but a four-limbed beast lurking behind the fractured lattice of logic itself. An attempt to correctly comprehend this creature requires a cognitive construction split across four axial quadrants. In the first step, the beast exists. It is here with us now, an adversarial addition to all that is material and true. Yet the second we step back, it disappears. For it is only an absence, forever receding into the realms of secret and rumor. In the third step, we find ourselves in a world where both its existence and absences hold true. For the third world is a beast of plenty and has much room to accommodate its many contradictions. In the fourth and final step, not only does the beast remain absent, but has become the face of absence itself. It is now the one who vanishes, the one we call violent, the wayward one, the weary, the world, the void, and the viewer. For it is perceived only in fragments, shaped in the names that we adorn upon it.
Thank you.
All right. So you invented your own conspiracy theory for today. Okay, cool.
It's actually by Nagarjuna. It's a Buddhist idea of like the fourfold negation. I just turned it into a beast.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well,
Uh,
one thing that I was going to say is some quick notes. Amazing starting point that it's capable of reciting the sutras, right? So this is a really crucial move when you have a creature. Remember, Mary Shelley makes this decisive decision too, to allow the Frankenstein's monster to speak. Not only to speak, but to be extremely eloquent. So it's hideous and malformed and it goes on rampages and killing sprees and all of that. But then it also, most of the text, if you guys remember, is long romantic monologues of him in the mountains crying out, cursing his creator, contemplating stuff. That's a very crucial move. There's also a terrible movie, far less artistic than Saja's work there, called 30 Days of Night, starring the eternal Josh Hartnett. It's a vampire movie. It's a bad vampire movie. But the one interesting thing about it is that it takes place in Alaska, where there's 6 months of night. So that's perfect feeding grounds and hunting grounds for vampires, obviously, so they don't have to sleep there. But what's intriguing is the vampires are shown as more beastly and animal than they are human. They're just pure fangs and they eat constantly and all that. But then there's one moment where there's a young woman and she's about to be devoured by the pack of vampires, and she's in the snow in Alaska, pitch black behind her, and she's crying, and she looks into the eyes of one of the vampires who has never spoken at this point in the film. So we have about 40 minutes without human language. And she goes, "Oh God." She trembles and says, "Oh God." And he looks around and looks her in the eye and says, "God? No God." All right? This is an interesting moment where it shows that he's capable of human speech. He's capable of understanding linguistics and grammatology. It's just not necessary when you got those teeth, right? They are walking events. Why talk about events when events can just happen, right? So this is interesting too. I love the fact that it can recite sacred texts is an intriguing move. I love the fact that you said that it's a figure of contradiction, because that's something that opens up all kinds of complexity. Again, it's something that I fear that one of the huge Achilles heels of psychoanalysis was that Freud disliked contradiction. He feared that it would jeopardize the credibility of his school of thought if he included contradiction too often. So what happens if schizophrenics contradict themselves in their visions? Then how can you define anything as schizophrenia? But to create a creature that is precisely powerful through contradiction, that's an art form. And the idea that contradiction can make one stronger, it's a Nietzschean principle of philosophy. But that's a great idea. And lastly, that it's a creature mainly of absence, not of presence. I've said this many times before. Sorry, this is a cliche. But the power of ghosts are not that they appear, apparition, apparere, to appear. It's that they disappear. That's what makes them terrifying. If they stayed there all night long, they'd become boring after a while. You'd ask them to leave. But I would just note that, Saj, I don't know if you remember if you took the child's imagination class with me as well, but there's a movie called The Never-Ending Story from the 80s, which is brilliant because the awful force that is destroying this kind of wonderland fantasy world is called the Nothing. Has no face. And you can only see it through its effects, meaning dark clouds across the sky, scorched earth kind of terrain, but you never actually see it because it is the nothing. And that's a very cool thing as well. something which is nothing. Great. Where are we going next? Thank you, Sai.
Thank you.
Next up is Lynn.
Hi. I wasn't sure if we had to come up with our own theory or if it was already an existent one. Anyway, I searched.
Can I answer that, Lynn, real quick? I would prefer if you all found actual ones that are arising, that are out there, that are not your own, because weirdly enough, the sophistication will come through the interpretation of it.
Okay, so then I
So-
understood it correctly because that's
Perfect.
what I did.
Excellent.
I actually have a theory which I think speaks quite well in relation to your presentation of the assemblage nature of the fear. It's quite crazy because it deals with a lot of fears at once, both social and otherworldly, and they mix different contexts. So it's a theory which is called glass camera, or Fred Golf theory. It was elaborated in the US, I think in the 80s and 90s, where supposedly they thought that in the USSR there were some machines which could transmit the experiences of psychics, and so they decided to build the machines which would have the same qualities, and therefore some kind of glass camera was built in order to project this otherworldly experiences, outer bodies experiences. And so there was a person, a psychic, the Fred Golf, who actually died while using this device. And so this device opened the view of heaven, or I don't know, of hell, of something beyond life. But then comes the even more insane part, because supposedly the US government decided to store this tape hidden, and so that nobody could find it and ever see it. But then the Catholic Church stole it from US government, and then it was locked forever in Rome. So I think it's a really crazy mixture of things, because it deals with relation. Well, I mean, the obvious one is the Cold War and the relationship between the fear of war, the fear of dominance, the fear that your own government is hiding something, the fear of death and of not knowing what it could possibly be, the fear of even dying inside a machine for a person who was actually supposed to search for experiences, that he himself also can die, but then also the fear of not knowing what comes up, but then of the person who know and who are purposefully hiding it, because I'm not sure what the reason is, but because maybe it's so horrible or so secret that one cannot bear it. And then the collision with church, so that we also have the fear that there are so many powerful dominant forces that the Catholic Church turns out to be even a greater power than the Russia and the US. So I think it's quite insane also in its hybridity and of all the multi-layers that it creates.
Well, that's amazing. Wow. I'm see, this is why I didn't want that 5-minute break, because we might have missed that. That's brilliant, Lynn. Thank you. So much there. First, I love the fact that the Catholic Church gets involved to steal the mechanism and hide it. Okay, what that demonstrates is two things. One is that conspiratorial agents can be thought to collude and work together sometimes. So CIA and the Catholic Church, right? They're both, believe so, CIA and Illuminati, or the Democratic Party and a ring of oligarchs of, you know what I mean? It's like sort of, they can actually join forces, almost like in comic books or in sort of other forms of fiction. So, and there's terms for that, by the way, metalepsis, Metalepsis is when typically incompatible worlds somehow come together. That's like the Avengers, right? So, you know, this superhero's world is never supposed to be the same as this one, but now we have a movie where they are coming together. Increasingly, that's happening, these metalepsies. So Catholic Church conspiracy should be Catholic Church, and CIA conspiracy should be CIA. The fact that now we have them working together, we're in a new age, right? Where anything goes, like you said, of hybridity. There's something really fascinating there too, because why would the church want to protect us from knowledge of the glass camera, which is a psychic premonition machine, like you said, right? And it's the same reason I would suspect that in Islam, you are not allowed to say that the call to prayer, which is, if you've ever heard the call to prayer in Islam, it's very lyrical and musical. It is a sin to call it music or singing. And it's also a sin to call the Quran poetry, even though it rhymes. So why is it that they go overboard to work so hard to drastically differentiate that sacred tradition from music and poetry, even though it's musical and poetic? It's the same reason why the Catholic Church would not want psychic visions to be confused with prophecies. If they're the guardians of prophecies, their biggest terror would become this amateurish, perverted version, which would be the psychic, the realm of the psychic, right? That's not messianic. That's a parlor trick or a carnival show. Do you follow? And so that's interesting that might be a reason. The idea of dying inside the machine, beautiful idea that you unwove there. It's also, by the way, goes to a childhood fear that children tell one another that if you die in your dream, you die in real life, right? Carried all the way to the implications of the Matrix, where Neo is told in the Matrix, if you die in the Matrix, your body dies in the physical world as well. So that's a really interesting thing. And, you know, this also, the fact that the glass camera conspiracy is catapulted energetically by Cold War paranoia that the enemy, is doing even more things or more drastic. Actually, I don't want anyone to Google this because it will sicken you and turn your stomachs. But recently I was looking into something in the Japanese history called Unit 731. Does anybody know this? Unit 731 was a covert biological and biochemical research center that performed all kinds of nasty, gruesome experiments on captives, including they tested dehydration, amputation, injecting salt water into the bloodstream, injecting animal blood, horse blood in particular, into the bloodstream of its patients, subjecting them to every type of venereal disease you could imagine, just horrific, hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered in this sort of fortress treatment center, which was an old palace. And actually that the whole thing was run by a series of professors, scientists, and 2 princes of the imperial family. And they were just it was a torture machine that was going to the outer limits of science of the day. By the way, very interestingly, a lot of their techniques were appropriated by the CIA later. So that's an interesting question of inheritance when we talk about fear and terror. So it's a big ethical question in the history of medical science as to who inherits Dr. Mengele's experiments from the Nazi period when he was doing transplants. One of the first people in history to be doing eye transplants, but without anesthesia on children, seeing if he could turn brown eyes blue, you know, for his supreme leader. Is it ethical to use whatever form of knowledge he was able to ascertain based on his hideous sadistic experiments, or should it be banished from public consumption? Well, in this case of Unit 731, the CIA took all kinds of the journals after World War II. They confiscated the journals of that secret compound. So this is interesting because it also means then that again, you brought this up, who does the glass camera fall into? Into whose possession does it fall into? Who gets hold of it, right? And this is a fear that we even have. You see it in like Indiana Jones, that who's going to get the Holy Grail? Is it going to be the Nazis who get the Holy Grail, or the Noah's Ark, right? Which means that they then get supernatural powers. And I always like to say this, what that demonstrates is something that goes against all concepts of morality, which is that weapons, terrifying weapons and forces of destruction, do not care who wields them. It's just a matter of circumstance of whoever finds them. This is even in terrible morality tales like Harry Potter, which to me are teenage melodrama. But even at the end, he realizes the most powerful wand in existence doesn't belong to anyone. It's not made for the righteous sorcerer. Any sorcerer can have it. It's just a question of who has it at the right time. It's the same as the Lord of the Rings with the rings. There's no moral discrepancy. So the glass camera is interesting because you put it on lockdown, right? And again, you guys, I don't want to get into big conspiracy, but one big conspiracy theory is that the COVID pandemic was caused by a weaponized virus that was created in a lab that then spilled, right? And there's a big question of intentionality, crisis of intentionality. Was it intentionally leaked? If so, was it leaked by a government or by an individual who went rogue? You're dealing with this with California wildfires as well. Is this an act of arson? Is it one person who set fire to the woods? Or is this a natural disaster? It matters legally, but it doesn't matter because both of them open onto different territories of fear then, and have different storylines of fear. So this is great. Thank you so much for this. Where are we going next?
Then we're going to Lace. Lace?
Yeah. Hello. I think mine is not so absurd, and this is why I specifically chose it, because it's kind of terrifying. It's haunting to think of something that is backed with some facts or false facts per se, but and it's related to what you previously mentioned, Jason. Joseph Mengele, he lived in Brazil for 17 years after he fled Germany after the war. And one theory is that Hitler never died. He fled to Argentina in a U-boat. And once he reached Argentina, he stayed there for a while, and then he actually moved to Brazil. And the theory is that he was actually interested in creating a new hike in Brazil, which is absurd. But then there are multiple documents that were sealed originally, but then in the 2000s, I don't know, they were opened by CIA with multiple views of Hitler, as if he was actually living in South America, and he was seen in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Brazil. And that was kind of weird, because when you think of possibilities, it's not in the realm of something so absurd or invisible, but it's just something that it was terrifying because it changed geopolitical and social landscape for a decade, right? And it resonated per se. And there is a specifically excerpt of a book that says that one of his plans was, Brazil interests me particularly. We will build a new Germany in Brazil. We will have everything beneath there. In Brazil, the conditions are met for a revolution to take place, capable of transforming in a few years a state governed by and populated by corrupt mestizos into a Germanic domain. Brazilians need us if they want to advance in their country. It is beyond our intention to land troops and seize Brazil by means of arms. Our weapons are invisible. Our conquerors have a more difficult mission, and that is why their weapons are more delicate to handle. There is a huge German colony in the south of Brazil, a massive cluster of neo-Nazis there investigated, and I was just wondering, like, what if that was real and he actually lived in Brazil, and the evidences are always conflicting. It's absolute truth that he died in the bunker in 45, and then a mass, just different reports say that the skull wasn't his, it was from a woman. And once you drive into that conspiracy theory, it's really dangerous, because once you have so many false facts, you kind of start to believing that, and it's just crazy to dive into that.
Brilliant. Because I want to start from the last thing you just said, which is that fear can be cumulative. And so maybe you don't believe a conspiracy. This is how conspiracy theories often work. you get introduced to one or exposed to one piece of evidence and you dismiss it skeptically. But then 2, 3, 4, 7, you follow, and the more it compounds, the more you start to, the wall of suspicion starts to drop and intrigue starts to like, wait a minute, you know, if there's this many people who are saying this, or if I've now, and God forbid if a legitimate person starts to say something, right? So now you have a former government official of the Israeli defense saying that aliens made contact 30 years ago, and that all the, this is true. He did say this before he died. He's like the defense minister of Israel, former and a general, said all the world governments know, and there's a pact to keep it quiet until they can introduce this knowledge to the human population. So when you get someone like that suddenly saying it, right, it becomes interesting. So here's where I have so much here. First of all, a phenomenon that goes and coincides with the Hitler retreating to Brazil idea, escaping to Brazil, is that there were Nazi hunters after World War II. Now, these were collectives of kind of paramilitary, you know, factions that went looking for Nazis that had escaped to South America, to other parts of Europe, right? And so that's an interesting thing, by the way. And there are films that are made about Nazi hunters and things like that. And whether or not, it's interesting whether their duty as vigilantes, because they're not legally police or, you know, military of any kind, and they're often going into other countries to try and detect people and unmask them, whether their job was to assassinate or to arrest. Since they have no legal authority to do either, it's interesting. Some were death squads that were supposed to kill Nazis if they were found, and others were former Nazis, and others were supposed to just out them. Another great idea is that this is a great concept associated with fear. Often when monsters get vanquished, when they get defeated, they go into hiding for a while. They retreat into the swamp, or they go back into, they find resting places, sanctuaries, refuges. So Brazil is a refuge for the monsters, but that's always meaning that they're dormant and they will make their return, right, someday. They just need to recuperate and heal and convalesce and gain momentum again. So it's a great idea about how fear sometimes withdraws precisely in order to resurrect itself. And that reminds me of something else. When you said Hitler had wanted to start his own utopian community in Brazil, right? This supposed hypothetical Hitler. There are actual case studies of cult leaders who recreated new cults in multiple places. So when one cult would fail in one city, they'd go to another city and start a new cult. The interesting thing is there's almost always experimental variability between the cult formations. They don't just go and rehearse the same script. So when I've studied this, I've studied figures who, I don't want to offend anybody, but there are actually some very famous ones throughout history, including Mormonism, right? That he was kicked out of three cities for trying to start movements. The interesting thing is every time he reintroduced this revolutionary new Christianity, it had new elements to it, new creative elements. New texts were found, new mythologies were part of the story. So it's interesting. I mean, in a horrifying way, it would be interesting to see what Hitler's second movement would have looked like. Would it have been an ideological copy of the racial Aryanism, you know, of the first, or would it have become something outlandish and bizarre and galactical and, you know, space aliens and stuff like that? Especially if many of you don't know this, just quickly, Nazism, do you know where the Nazi Party originates from? Go look up the Thule Society, Thule. This was a cult that Heinrich Himmler was involved. This is Hitler's second in charge, who believed that Aryans were alien. Are you ready for this? We're actually part of an alien race created in time with all kinds of capacities for telepathy and levitation and all of that. And actually Himmler spent money, Hitler's money, going in search of the Holy Grail, Thor's hammer. Thor's hammer, he was trying to find sacred artifacts and all that. That's where Indiana Jones gets the idea from, right? So there's a lot of occultism. There's Romanian fascism, where they would drink their own the brother's blood at their banquets every evening. They would drink each other's blood in long chalices. There's all sorts of stuff like that. So the last points I want to get to, which is fascinating, and thank you for this, is resemblance then. So this is when people refuse to believe that someone has died, they start looking at people who look like them a little bit, right? And you see photographs and sightings and all of that. And we fall into, and paranoia is all about resemblance, right? If you want to see, by the way, where fear plays out at a biopolitical level, racial profiling, right? Which is all based on guilt by resemblance. You look like someone who is a suspect that we're looking for. You follow? Hence, we can brutalize you, search you, strip you of your rights temporarily, your civil rights. So that's where you see it played out. But this plays out in the paranoid scheme of this person looks like an 80-year-old Hitler. Well, I'm sorry to say, like most 80-year-old men look like an 80-year-old Hitler, right? They all kind of, you know, it kind of physiologically, it becomes an inevitability at a certain point. So anyway, and then here's the really tragic and disturbing question. What is the vested interest psychologically in keeping the myth of Hitler alive? Well, we could understand that there are populations that don't want him to be dead. And that is, let's say, neo-Nazis don't want him to be dead. But even more, the paranoid myth that Hitler is alive is kept alive by his enemies. It's Jewish victims that promote, of the catastrophe, who promote the idea that Hitler was still alive, potentially, in South America. And the reason of that is the extreme traumatic fear that was associated with what they went through. What if he's not dead? Which is what everybody asks in every horror movie. What if it's not really dead? What if it's not gone? Right? What if it comes back? But also, and this is, I don't want to inject a perverse element here, but don't underestimate the extent to which having an enemy gives you purpose and existential significance. What are you when the void occurs, when he's dead? When for so long you have been the tragic one, right? What happens when he's gone? Well, then now you're in the abyss of having to reconstruct a narrative of identity. And so perversely, maybe even entertaining the myth that he's not dead buys you time of something that you've adjusted to, a self-image. I'm not making that as a mass scale commentary or critique of it's how identity structures work. It's why ideologies persist for hundreds, if not thousands of years, a lot of times. So anyway, awesome stuff. Wow, very cool. That's a lot of stuff we got out of that. Thank you.
Next up is Sensa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, a little bit.
Give me just a moment. Is it better now?
Perfect. I can hear you. Yes, perfect. Go ahead, Sensa.
Nice to meet you all. We have seen with some of you already. I want to follow Lai's path, not on the Nazi stuff, despite it's quite interesting, but on the reason why I chose two of the options I chose, which I'm going to try to be brief about them, because both of them are reiterative and have precedents in both mainstream and fringe history when talking about fringe history, which is to say popular culture. And also, before I do that, I had like a shitty thought developing while we were having this seminar, and it's just that in some way, most confabulations all are a conspiranoical effort. Conspiracy is not necessarily conspiranoia. Confabulatory thought disorders, specifically, like the ones mentioned initially in the seminar, tend to operate as conspiranoical. This difference is more present, for example, in Spanish linguistically. Like conspiración is not the same like conspiranoia, because we can obviously see that conspirational efforts, it's to conspire, it's a way of human approach to relationships, right? Conspiranoia goes on the rabbit holes, to say it in a way. also bringing up the mentioning of Dali's paranoid critical method. These approaches are hugely conspiranoical in the sense that they think that they mostly work under esoterical and spiritual human outputs or frameworks, right? In the given case of Dali, it's this esoterical exploration of the senses. While he did that, but at the same time, it went along with the privance of having sexual intercourse. So it's a whole scheme of practices, right? It's not just like, I'm gonna do this thing so I can paint my shitty little paintings. I'm gonna do a lot of things so I can do these shitty little paintings. On the other hand, it's something that is present in a lot of esoterical and spiritual human outputs through history. Another example that I thought immediately was Austin Osman's Spare Death posture. Like submersing yourself onto, I don't know, losing the way of oxygen onto your brain for a couple of minutes so you can lose consciousness briefly and then come back with the vision. It's hugely practiced. The continual consumptions of substances, all of this work in favor of conspiranoical efforts, not necessarily things related to actual conspiracies. In that sense, the two main conspiracy theories I chose go through the line of what now people call like Twitter theory. Despite I'm not in Twitter, I get the concept. Like, it's very Twitter-esque. It's very like word on word, and it stops working as confabulatory and is rather the other way it was shown in that text. I read it like expansive paraphrenia. It's it's rather expansive than confabulatory. And the first one, it's like the classics. We have already mentioned it. Aliens do exist. Aliens are real. But the conspiranoical part or the conspiracy theory is that they are virus. The aliens are the virus and the virus are alive. Viruses have consciousness. That's the number one. And the second one, it's also widely documented and discussed, quite Twitter-esque actually. The one-shot thesis that suddenly in history a monkey took some ayahuasca or like a mushroom or something and gained consciousness, and that drove him crazy. That is replicated onto, for example, the existence of the Unabomber of Ted Kaczynski's terrorist efforts. I think that's the same thing that's happening with Luigi Mangione, and I think that's the same thing that's happening with all of these single terrorist acts which have been happening in the US according to that. I think that's what's happening with the Singapore terrorist efforts of online radicalized people. And I think all of this, it's an effort put online to make the weaker ones, quote unquote, come out of the surface, influenced by these theories, so that by the time my daddy Trump and Elon Musk go to power, have 4 years of juicy national security systems and plans, which they are gonna offer, obviously. So they have to have their background, and their background, it's what's happening now with these quote unquote insurgents. I think they're just like a psyop or something like it. And yeah, those are my theories.
Outstanding, outstanding. No, I'm just so much here. So interesting thing. Well, you started by noticing popular culture. So that is you just mentioned that in passing. I just want to say that because how fears are transmitted, whether they are, let's say, conveyed ideologically as scapegoats by a government authority. So you have this top-down pyramidal transmission of a fear of the other, of the foreigner, of the enemy. That's different than fears that are transmitted through popular culture. And that's different than the history of folklore, which is like old ladies in the villages who tell you stories about beasts that are in the swamps or creatures that might eat you at night or things like that. So it's really important. That's great where the narrative sort of channel is, who the puppet masters of them are at different times, or what machine is generating them. You mentioned the etymology of conspiracy, which is awesome, and it's great to hear the Spanish sort of differentiation of it. Conspire, I've mentioned this in other classes, maybe that's why I didn't say it here. If you take the ancient Greek, it comes from like to respire, spiros, breath, to breathe together. And so when you said that it's not just an abstract kind of format. It's a doing of things. It's an action. It's a series of actions. Yeah, actually, conspiracy links to breath itself. It's an act of breathing. So it's that existentially bound to our material conditions. So that's a great point. Just I wanted to play. Dali, interestingly, you mentioned the losing oxygen and rituals of of hypoxia. They've talked about cave paintings. Astronauts have had visions sort of in when oxygen gets cut off. And there are people, we even, since I did a seminar on a group called Le Grand Jeu, the Great Game, which were 4 teenagers who experimented with inhaling all kinds of things and near-death experiences, but also anesthesia. And so they were doing that too. Interesting thing, Dali, of all the people, since you mentioned him too, notoriously not into drugs. Severe aversion to drug culture.
That's right. Yeah. But he did like other quirky stuff.
Yeah, he did other weird stuff, right? He picked his vices for sure. Definitely. He chose other, but strangely, because given the fact that surrealists actually, many of them did experiment with drug experiences, he was deeply against it. And he was much more interested in exploring, as you know, the borderland between sleeping and waking. So he used to have his wife wake him up in the middle of the night, shake him, and he would paint from that. Or he would try to paint right at the instant where he was slipping into unconsciousness in that oblivion boundary. I love the fact that you bring up the aliens are a virus conspiracy, because I like that entire taxonomies are now being classified as potential alien remnants. So the octopus is getting a reputation online these days, like as proof of alien invasion millions of years ago, or that it was a civilization of aliens that preceded, the typologies of life that we know, and that it was brought in from other planets and all of that stuff, because it doesn't resemble things other things that we see in biology. Even certain insects are increasingly being like, this is proof of alien presence and stuff like that. But it's even better when it does what you said it does, which is when people say, no, the octopus is not an object left by an alien. So the octopus is an alien, right? And the intelligence of the octopus is an alien intelligence. Or bees are actually aliens that are doing surveillance on us. You know what I mean? Things like, so this is when we cross a very fragile threshold to now it's already among us. The fear is already within us, already among us, right? It's like
which makes sense on what you mentioned, right? Like the way in which confabulations tend to pass onto one another. Once again, the passing breathing.
Absolutely. What troubles me about it, though, is that anytime you see an upsurge of populist ideology in politics, like in the United States, it's based upon the increasing suggestion that the threat is already internalized. So it's not a Cold War situation where the enemy is out there in a foreign territory. It's sleeper cells. They're already here. The population itself is the enemy, right? Minorities that already exist here, or women, or liberals, or entire segments of actual people who are already part of the society, then become demonized as the perversion or pollution. So that's something that it's just something to note. And when you mention, this is interesting, when national security systems, you said, right, justify. So we all know how 9/11 was manipulated by the US government to create all kinds of retract civil liberties. I never believed in those civil liberties to begin with. I know that the logic of the state is that it can kill you anytime it wants, right? I've lived in enough totalitarian societies not to think this is not a totalitarian society, right? That I'm living in the US. Just because it has better decorations and air conditioning doesn't mean that it's less violent, obviously, in that regard, or less authoritarian. But here's something interesting, since I want to complicate your notion that of what happens whenever there's a fear that national security systems use it to justify new authoritarian policies. That is, you are right, the case. But always there's a backlash where people feel the government is not in control enough. And so they start throwing dice and affiliating themselves with occult channels. So in Saudi Arabia, I've mentioned this before, Saudi Arabia has 9 anti-witchcraft units as part of its federal police investigating thing that are supposed to go and round up sorcerers. And it's sad because they've already executed a few people under accusations of sorcery, and they've banned certain books. But these are high-level police agents who are supposed to ward off the evil eye, who are supposed to go and find evidence of superstition being practiced. Now, here's the cool thing. It's just like Foucault doesn't go far enough to say this, but if you really pressed him and said, did the asylums invent schizophrenia, or were there weird people roaming the countryside of the ancient world that then necessitated the invention of the asylum or something like that? He would tell you the weird people came first. The madness came first. And then an apparatus of institutionalization, confinement, persecution, punishment. Well, in the same thing, it's not that the Saudi government was paranoid. It's that people were actually going back to occult practices. Witchcraft was getting popular again, right? And it's a weird thing how a government negotiates that. So in Cuba, for instance, you have a communist government for decades, which is supposed to be atheistic and secular and anti-religious, but Santeria was a huge part of Cuban culture and it was allowed. Castro kind of allowed this contradiction to be practiced quietly, right? Where people could do kind of occult rituals and stuff like that. Here's where it's really interesting: when the church allows it. So the church allows witchcraft to be practiced. They know that the same people who come on Sunday and give them money and are their followers also go to the local witch for a curse or a blessing or a healing, which is heretical to their orthodoxy. And yet it occurs nevertheless. And it's a really weird thing, because I even have my own family who are some people in Iran, for instance, who from my wife's side, they are religious. They go to the mosque, they pray, whatever, but then they also partake in all kinds of superstitious rituals that are outlawed by the religion, and they see no problem with this. And the government doesn't, and the clergy don't, which is really interesting too. So, but in Saudi Arabia, they did. And the reason wasn't because it was anti-Islamic. That's it's that it's anti-modern. They are in a massive modernization thrust, building artificial cities, building smart cities, building all kinds of towers and all of that. And all of a sudden, the fact that they started documenting weird esoteric rituals occurring throughout the country again, and youth doing it, that's what bothered them. It's young people who, there was the body of it was a wolf in women's lingerie that was left hanging in the middle of a town at night. The carcass, the corpse of a wolf with women's lingerie. And that created a huge manhunt throughout the country to find out who's doing that in Saudi Arabia. That's what they fear, because you can't sell to the globe that you are creating the coolest city, cities of the future, when you have wolves with lingerie hanging from street lamps, right? So anyway, very cool stuff. Thank you so much. Where are we going next?
Next up is Savvy. I just want to note that we have about 15 minutes left and still 6 people who would like to present, potentially more. So we might need to be a little bit efficient. But yeah, Savvy, feel free to take over.
Okay, let's.
That's efficient. They're not there. If they're not Savvy, are you there?
Yes, I'm trying to share my screen. Oh wait, I think it. Well, I'll do without the images. Well, the Brazilian fear of communism. Brasília, Distrito Federal, Brazil, January 8, 2023. A little less than 2 years ago, the fear of reality took over a part of the Brazilian population, affectionately nicknamed Bolsominions. Before delving deeper into the climax of this story, I would like to recap some stories surrounding this plot. Bolsominions are creatures driven by hate, fear, delirium, and hysteria, heralds of a normative, white, hetero, cis, militaristic, and far-right identitarism. They choose a messiah from themselves, a horrendous being who encanted them with his political incorrect, aka murderous way of being. His name is Jair Messias Bolsonaro, the king of cattle. Armed with the lobby of the bullet, the cattle, and the gospel, Jair Messias Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil, taking office in 2019. Fear, hate, corruption, fascism, and genocide, all synonyms, take over Brazil during this period. Many of those fears, which had been part of a political agenda for a long time, were not directed at the oppressed and the opposition, but at the Bolsominions themselves, Bolsonaro cattle. Among these fears that were widely incited by the King of Cradle, in conjunction with famous martyrs such as Steve Bannon and big techs with their techno-fiddles, such as Musk and Zuckerberg, armed with fake news, there were conspiracy theories about evil transgenders destroying the country and its children, about the lazy indigenous populations that only served to destroy big businessmen and take advantage of government money, neutral language and its destruction of the magnificent Portuguese language, homosexuals who distributed gay kits and dick bottles in schools, China and its project to create a spread and deadly virus throughout the world, which could only be cured with chloroquine, public and federal schools and universities that would be indoctrinating their students to become shield-eating communists. Union of Socialist Republics of Latin America, as known as URSAL, a secret communist sect that would be planning to take over the country and even accused of writing the 2018 electoral ballot boxes, among other barbarities, which in 2022, on October 30, after Bolsonaro's democratic defeat at the polls for Lula, according to Bolsonaro and his followers, a bent herald of communism, was which made all this cattle gather in front of the gates of several national armies calling for a military coup, supported by the supposed Article 142 of the Constitution, an article that does not actually authorize a military intervention, contrary to what Bolsonaro said. Having their largest concentration in the camp set up in the general headquarters of the urban military sectors in Brasília, capital of Brazil, 9 kilometers from Praça dos Três Poderes, space that contains the three buildings that represent the three powers of the Brazilian Republic, being then the Palácio do Planalto, headquarters of the executive, the Palácio do Supremo Federal da Corte, headquarters of Judiciary, and the Palace of National Congress, headquarters of the Legislature. They camped there for 70 days. The concentration of people began to increase from January 5th until the fateful day that I come to present to you. January 8, 2023, Brasília. The Bolsonarist cattle then began to move to the headquarters to Praça dos Três Poderes, and at 2:42 p.m., what would be 5 hours of unbridled destruction began. Strategically, that day, the police and the army were working with reduced number of agents, as it had all been planned. Then they began to break and invade the buildings, breaking the buildings, historical works of art and furniture, defecating in every room, taking photos and live streaming all the barbarity in a joke manner, leaving an estimated loss of more than 16 millions of reais to the public coffers. In addition to the destruction of priceless objects, such as work of art of de Cavalcante's, relic of Portuguese crown, and 20 other works, all in name of the fear of reality of a left-wing president having won the election democratically, and all about the fear of communism, which has continued to haunt Brazilians since the time of the military dictatorship. It's that. The image I planned to bring were more impacting than my speech, I think, and then I have some memes.
You can upload that for us into the group chat or sort of the course site. You can upload that. I'd like to see the image.
I will send it to the chat. Then you can see the the barbarity and the memes and left about it.
So it's very profound and powerful what you're talking about. Of course, everything you say is wonderfully documented and happening and still happening there and in other places. There's one thing that this is troubling you. It would be much easier to just agree outright and say that you have this brutalizing authoritarian rise of an authoritarianism. That's almost the easy part. The tough part in what you've diagnosed there is to ask, and it's a problem that Marx had to face, right? The question of why are the masses coalescing around such a figure? And you can debate whether it's a majority or a minority. It doesn't matter. A substantial enough portion of the population is spellbound by this specter, right? Of power and of fear. And it would be very easy as leftists or whatever to simply condemn the masses as stupid or as having false consciousness. And that's going to get you nowhere, by the way, in terms of unpacking the riddle of why it's successful, why it's thriving, why this fear is forming a regime type, right? And why these nightmares are palpable. So this is the thing. And this is gonna bother my communist friends in the room, but is the fear of communism that is overplayed and hyped up and villainized by figures like Bolsonaro and others? Is it a misunderstanding of a justifiable fear of something lurking in the ideology? They don't know how to articulate it or interpret it. They misunderstand the transmission of the radio signals, but there is a suspicion towards it that may be justified. And we know enough histories of the failure of and successes also, but failure of communist ideologies with purges and death camps and prison camps as well that have to be accounted for, obviously. So but that's not that I'm not saying that's what they're actually keeping in mind or that they know of. But what you're actually dealing with here, then, this is a tricky thing. So I wonder what you would say to this. How to differentiate the people who are followers of a dictator? How do you differentiate the desire to belong from the fear of not belonging? Right? And that's where, again, it becomes problematic for us because we're playing at a boundary then, where is it that they desire to belong more or are they terrified of not belonging? And that goes into something that we should talk about more and more. Just like I have seen people perform for dictatorships, sort of, or for high-level political officials, and put on an act and overperform themselves. Is that a desire to be seen by the leader or a fear of not being seen by the leader? Right? And again, they interchange very much. One last thing that I would note in your analysis is that you rightly point out that you have a weird structure of a so-called charismatic leader on top, who then circulates their oppression or their fear through bureaucratic agencies, military, police, government, other government officials. You follow? And so this is an important thing, because then we're not dealing with the shark in Jaws, where you only have to worry about one entity. Here we have a district, and this is crucial because that's how fascism operated. You had a symbolic figure of the Führer on top, but really it was a bureaucratic apparatus and a bureaucratic contraption. So, and it's very interesting, by the way, when you mentioned scapegoating transgenderism. I have a transgender colleague who is doing some fascinating work that demonstrates that a lot of the original communists in Lenin's own cabinet were cross-dressers. We're talking about in the 1910s and 20s, and that it was completely okay within party lines that was well aware that they had these so-called double lives, or these sort of alternate experiences or identities. And it was actually, there was, to early communism's credit, it was widely accepted. Interestingly, by the 1950s and 60s, communism demonizes in certain places, Castro's Cuba for one, and other places, demonizes homosexuality and transgenderism as a bourgeois pathology later. But it's a weird thing to try and figure out how it made that turn. Like why the early communists had no problem whatsoever with gender fluidity, and then it evolves, and it has to do with power. It has to do with taking power, obviously. But anyway, there's a lot there. But it would be really interesting to not just see how the fear was imposed upon people, but what is it they're actually afraid of, is an interesting Freudian question. And the last point, and just this is the last thing I'll say, and then we got to move on, is so you mentioned that you have totalitarianism hiding in the folds of democracy. So you have an authoritarian leader that is costuming themselves through electoral campaigns, congressional and parliamentary maneuvers. And so, yes, totalitarianism can now wear the mask of democracy. And that's not something, it's radical for us to acquaint ourselves with, but it's actually something that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle all warned about as well. If you go way back to ancient Greek political philosophy, which is why none of them were proponents of democracies, among other reasons. Thank you, Sally. Next, please. You could.
So we are actually out of time. I would suggest that people.
Karen, do we have 3 minutes left on my thing? It says 11:27.
We have 3 minutes. I just thought you maybe want to.
Param has been hanging. Param, can you finish us off on a cool note?
Sure. I will keep it very short. I will drop the link in the chat box so you can save it and watch it later. What the link shows is the graphic design of a computer slowly shutting down, slowly being overwhelmed, and therefore the game slowly going into a dark void. And this emerged from having conversation with other friends and colleagues and artists around me. And I noticed that there are actually people around me who are terrified that might happen to them in life. It was so interesting to me. And even though there is no term to describe it, but you could see that fear or video as a contemporary form of I don't know, a solipsism syndrome or a Truman Show delusion or some sort of a simulation hypothesis kind of turning into a nightmare or going to extreme. And I'll stop.
What specifically happens explain again what specifically happens in that in that video or that?
So I dropped it in the chat box so you can watch it. It's basically the graphic the graphic card of a console or a video game or a computer slowly getting overwhelmed and shutting down slowly. So in the video game, the details of the game are slowly disappearing and the game is shutting down very slowly. Which you can literally observe it glitching out, and yeah, yeah, I will stop right there. I
Well,
know.
no, that's such a brilliant place for us to conclude, because glitching like that and malfunction is going to be such a huge part of where we are right now in the history of technology as well. That Param, if I were to tell you, wherever you are in the world right now, if I were to tell you your challenge is to take the next 2 days and find me as much evidence of the fact that you are living in a simulation as you can, right?
Yeah.
You would go looking and hunting for glitches, right?
Yeah.
And guess what? You'd come back in 3 days with some awesome evidence for all of us.
Jason, I've just finished a 40,000 word book on the topic that is going to be published soon.
That's perfect. So you know how to tune your radar. You know, if you tell somebody there's an old trick of manipulation. If you send somebody a mysterious box with a message in it that says you are cursed, at first they dismiss it, but then suddenly they trip and fall later that day. And then suddenly they get a bad phone call with some bad news. Radical negativities happen constantly in our midst, but we don't place them into an interpretive kind of, sort of assembly line. But if we tell ourselves in advance that I'm on the lookout for evidence of radical negativity or disruption or glitches or falseness, you'll find it everywhere. And it's actually, that is a euphoric process of discovery, because without getting too much into this, I know Caroline will yell at me because we're overboard now. She's monitoring time well for us. When we talked about euphoria, there is a dysphoric form of paranoia, which just the more you confirm, you get the sickly righteousness of the truth teller, which is that obnoxious, annoying political friend of yours who constantly wants to, you know what I mean, tell you without any hint of irony or play or laughter, just wants to impose, their viewpoint and tell you why they are right. And that's a sickly pleasure principle. That's what Nietzsche called he calls it the soothing indignation of the anarchist and the socialist, which he was very suspicious of. And by the way, Forough Farrokhzad, the great poet, talks about this with her own brother in the Sometimes I Weep for the Garden, her poem, where she says, my brother wears his outrage like an identity card. Meaning he's obnoxious. He comes over every night and he talks about the regime and how terrible this is and the monarchy is. And he's right, of course. But why does he desperately need to be right all the time? It becomes his identity, and it's a sickly pleasure principle of superiority complex. What you're talking about, though, is different. Going on the move and going into the street looking for glitches, looking for disruptions and disquiets and lapses, is a euphoric process in some ways, even if the conclusion is that we are in an artificial simulation, and we have been for 100,000 years. Or that this is the echo of a class that happened 1 million years ago, or the hologramic resuscitation. We all actually died 100 million years ago, and we're just replaying this in a loop of sin. Even if that's the conclusion, there's euphoria in the search for components and puzzle pieces. You know what I mean? To get there. And so that's what I want to unlock more for us then.
Jason, do you mind if I email you with stuff about this? And yeah,
absolutely. I don't know if I can read 40,000 words right now, but I have a 2-year-old. I have a 2-year-old who doesn't let me read 40 words, but I would love to see what you're working on. Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. All right, Caroline, I promise we're done. For next week then, what was the next one that everybody's working on? So we're going to find, they're coming for us, whoever they are, right? That's up to you. Go to the hills and find me cool stuff. Look forward to it. And I promise, Luis, Gabby, and Soroush, you should start then next time. Okay, you'll be the first ones up.
I would also just quickly suggest that everyone can share what they found for today, either in the Discord or in the Google Drive, but that it would be nice to see whatever people found.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. All right, everyone. Take care until next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye, take care.